Yo, what's going on, E7 fam? Pat here, and today we're gonna do something crazy different. As you probably know, because I've said it in a couple of videos, I've been playing Epic 7 since day one. And in my last video, I talked about Cecilia Bot, which is the website on your screen now, and how I think it's a really good resource for players. And one of the really great resources that Cecilia Bot has is the Ultimate Timeline feature, right? So let me close on the ongoing events. You can see currently we have 2 days left on Blooming Lidica and all of these wonderful events. But if you go down here to this scroll bar, you can drag it all the way back here to where I started the game on November 7th, 2018 at 7 p.m. So I thought it'd be a pretty cool idea to go back and talk about Epic 7 before Epic 7 had a global server. And if you guys really like this style of content, then maybe I'll talk more about the state of the game over the span of its 5-year lifespan at this point, right? You can see here, 5 years, 2 months, and 0 days ago is when Destina came out, who was the first banner we ever had on global. And it's one of the reasons why people didn't advocate as strongly to reroll for her. She was encouraged to be rerolled for, but you could get somebody else and then obviously roll for this. So, speaking of rerolls, we're going to look at the ancient tier list of rerolling, which I'll put up on your screen now because I think this is actually hilarious. This image is like a relic from the past. This thing is crazy. So, before this game came out, there weren't that many content creators, and I remember very vividly there were people who were hyping this game about a month before launch. I remember Scion Storm, for example, talking about characters like Euphine being pretty good because she was like a relatively recent add to the game, but she wouldn't be somebody you could just straight up re-roll for at launch. So basically, people who had played the KR version had come up with a reroll tier list, and before you got into Epic 7, like right before the game came out, this image here that's on your screen, this was like the holy grail, right? This is what everyone considered to be like the tier list, the rankings for the characters, which looking back on it now is really, really funny knowing what we know now in 2024. So let's start. We'll go through the tank class, this image calls it, the knight class. We'll talk about the knights first, and I'll kind of explain to you why characters were where they were and whether or not they got it right. Again, I think this is just a really fun trip down memory lane. So first up, we have Shadow Rose. You'll notice that there are 3 rankings that this reroll tier list decided to go with. There is the world ranking, which is how good are they at clearing adventure. Boss, which is essentially how good are you at Abyss, and Hunts, which is kind of weird that they would group both those together. And then Arena, which back in the day when this game came out, all we had was Arena. We didn't have World Arena, real-time Arena, right? And we didn't have Guild Wars. So the only form of PvP that mattered was Arena. How good you were at the game was Arena, right? That was kind of it. And you wanted to have a good Arena team because obviously, as we all know now, you get Skystones and a bunch of other rewards. That's kind of why. So if you look at Crimson Rose, as it's listed here, it shows Shadow Rose, A+ in Adventure, S+ in Abyss and Hunts, which is wild because the only hunt she's ever been really good at is Banshee. And even then, she was pretty quickly outclassed within a couple of months of people kind of discovering that strat. And then Arena. Believe it or not, when Epic 7 came out, Shadow Rose was the best opener in the entire game. We talk about crazy openers we have now, like your Rands, your Zeos, your Kunkka, Aurelius's, right? Shadow Rose was the absolute best opener because her S3 would just, shove the entire enemy team to the back of the line. And you were just like, damn, what a crazy powerful opener. Until we all kind of realized that, Shadow Rose isn't really that fast. Like, if I just quickly go over here and just search, we could just check real fast her actual speed. I'll pull it up. I'll throw it up on the screen for you now. What do we got? 107 speed. That is That was considered the best opener in the game in Epic 7. 107. Can you believe it? Yeah, actually kind of nuts. So yeah, Shadow Rose was considered like the god pull. I remember on Reddit people saying like, "Oh, congratulations, you pulled Shadow Rose, you won the game. You have the best arena team now ever." Obviously, that wouldn't last super long by the summer of 2019. That would kind of not be the case anymore, but it's still funny to look back on it and think like, man, Shadow Rose was like the character. Crimson Armin at number 2. This was not surprising. This was actually the best knight in the entire game. They had it at number 2. They were pretty close, but this was actually the best in the entire game because Crimson Armin actually mitigated more damage, if you can believe it or not, more damage back then than she does now. Security state, if I recall correctly, was way stronger than it currently is on live. And also her S3, her Holy Shield, gave 3 turns of immunity as opposed to the current 2 that eventually ended up getting nerfed in the great nerfing of the late summer, early fall of 2019. But we'll talk more about that in perhaps another video. And you can see the rest here. We have Armin, which I don't really ever remember Armin being super good. Same thing here with Tywin. Rose was actually pretty solid. And as time went on, Rose actually kind of started to gain a little bit of use, especially when World Arena had first come out. Rose actually was pretty decent. Then you have Big P, Arwell, Charlotte, who was not particularly great before her rework. Crozet, Raz, Clury. Clury being here third from the bottom is actually hilarious because if you know anything about the history of Epic 7, Falconer Clury was the best knight in the game alongside Crimson Armin for a very, very long time. So to see her here, a third from the bottom, really funny. I'm not 100% sure if when this list was made, if Falconer Clury was out. Falconer Clury was available at global launch, but I don't know if this was actually made beforehand, right? So there was a chance that Falconer Clury might not have been available until global launch, and people just didn't know kind of any better. And then you have Maya, and then obviously Combat Maya here at the bottom. And Combat Maya, aka Fighter Maya, is also really funny to me because this was considered the worst knight in the game, like an absolute dud of a Moonlight 4-star pull. And then obviously as time went on, she became a insane PvP unit. People started to realize the power of Fighter Maya and how crazy good she was in Guild Wars. It's kind of why I made How to Play Fighter Maya back in the day, because when I made the video, pretty good new player friendly character for actually picking up easy dubs in Guild Wars. Moving on to the warrior class, we have probably the most famous character that came out of this patch, the launch of Epic 7. Martial Artist Ken, ML Ken, the boogeyman of the game. At launch, this was considered the absolute best character in the whole game. And I remember my friend Joe very famously pulling ML Ken like on his like first or second Galaxy pull as a free-to-play player, and he was literally for years, for me and my friends, the embodiment of the free-to-play by the way meme, because that was literally what Ken was. Ken was like super broken, and if you had him, you were so massively advantaged in Arena. It was unreal, because back then, we didn't have uncounterable units. We didn't have Little Queen Charlotte or Savior Auden to just like burst this guy. So you just kind of died to Ken, because like, how do you attack him? There was no like safe way to actually kill this character. So anything hit him, you're just like, well, guess my character dies on the crackback. There's nothing I can do about it. So Arena was basically all the best players had ML Ken. And Galaxy pulls, we didn't have this 20 pulls to get a guaranteed 4-5 back then. And Galaxy pulls were way, way more infrequent than they are now. You'd get like maybe one Galaxy pull a month, unless you were some kind of Giga Whale. And even then, because there was like no pity, none of this stuff, and the rates were so low on Galaxy summons that you could see people spend 4, 5, 10K and still not have ML Ken. People would re-roll, like speed run to the end, see if they get ML Ken, and if they did, they'd keep the account, because he was just that insane of a character at the time, at least for PvP. It says here that World, Adventure, he was OP. Not really. I think that's just them kind of saying like, hey. But yeah, ML Ken was pretty much the boogeyman of Epic 7 PvP until we finally started to get new Moonlight 5 stars entered into the pool, and we'll talk more about those probably in a later video. General Purgus also considered very good at this time because he's got the built-in CR push if you attack him, so that obviously makes him great for arena defense, and he's got a stun, which is kind of rare at this point because we don't have like really fast units. Like speed gear is hard to get at this time. Right side gear in general is just like non-existent, it feels like. So having a character that gives you some speed attached to the character in the kit as well as the stun is pretty good. Judge Kisa, you can see here it says Arena OP because she was basically like the cleaver, and she was a lot of people's like most desirable unit. I would say most people were falling into two camps at the time. You had people who were like diehard, tryhards. They would try and go for ML Ken. Everybody else, myself included, really wanted Judge Kisei because, well, personality. So, yeah, Judge Kisei was like the cleaver for Arena. And then we come here to, it says here, Wolven Kartuha. But the Assassin Kartuha was probably one of the most divisive characters in the game because you would ask people what they thought of this character, and some people, like from the Korean server, would tell you Assassin Kartuha is a top 5 unit in the entire game. He is absurd. He's insane in Abyss, and he's insane in Arena, and he's just nuts because he has the stun and the dodge, and he's just really, really good in general. And I remember my friend Crest also had very good success at the start of his E7 career with Assassin Kartuha in Abyss and Arena as well. But you would ask other people, what do they think about him? And they're like, he's kind of dog. He's not very, very good. He's actually pretty bad. And I think as time went on, people started to realize, like, yeah, he really isn't that good. But I remember he was definitely one of the more divisive characters. Like, some people would say he's a top tier. Other people would say he's like low tier or bottom tier. Robbie is actually a really interesting one on this list because Robbie, before Global Server came out, was like super broken and was actually, I believe, the first character ever to get nerfed in the KR server, and that caused like a whole big stink, a whole big controversy, which is why they weren't like super big on nerfs. It didn't really come to a head where we got the no nerf policy until later in 2019. But yeah, Robbie was considered just like so overtuned during her launch in Korea. But even then, she was still considered one of the better things you could pull, but you couldn't reroll for her. So yeah, that's kind of it. We have a Secret here next, considered really good in Abyss. Clarissa was considered very good all around. She was considered one of the strongest 4 stars in the game. I remember when Crest ended up pulling Clarissa in his starting multi. He started with Charlotte and Clarissa, and it was like a huge deal that he had started with Clarissa. And even another one of my friends started with Clarissa, and they're just like, oh my god, it's like the best 4-star in the game. That was definitely up there. Church of Ilios Axeman here, basically Axe God as he was deemed to be, was probably the recommended damage dealer that was paired with what is the Holy Trinity. And we'll talk a little bit more about them as we come across them here. But yeah, this character was kind of just insane at start because he was one of the easiest MLs to pull. Remember, when the game first came out, most people didn't have ML pulls. And most people, when they finally cleared episode 1 and unlocked Galaxy Summons, there's a pretty good chance that you were going to be pulling a 3-star. So if you had to pull a 3-star, you were hoping it was Axe God because he was just really good. He provided very good damage for very little investment. So you could very realistically like clear most of the hard content in Epic 7 with Axe God, along with the Holy Trinity, which we'll talk about one of its other members coming here up in a second, which is honestly way too low. So we have Lorena. Lorena, with the release of the global server, we got the specialty change for Commander Lorena like right at the start. And Commander Lorena was considered like the best Abyss DPS in the game, and considered she was a connection hero even back then, myself included. Lorena was my hard carry for a very long time. Like, I want to say for like the first 5 or 6 months of the game until we got Luna, Lorena was my girl. She was literally my hard carry, my main DPS on my team. So to see her here at A+ is really funny because a lot of people I knew, Lorena was like that character. Like, you played either Sez, Lorena, or Axe God. Like those were your primary 3 DPSs. Like those were like the DPSs that defined Abyss and Adventure for the most part. Not super great in Arena, but for any PvE content, Lorena was definitely one of the best. Chloe here at A+, wasn't particularly seen as very good, even back then. We see here it says Tierria, but this is Tierria. Tierria was what was part of what was known as the Holy Trinity, which is Tierria, Elson, and Ricorous. These 3 stars together basically let you to beat any PvE content in the entire game. They were just completely busted. Tierria ended up getting nerfed pretty early on in E7's lifespan. I want to say like maybe 2 months into the game, because they realized the devs were like, nobody's playing 5 stars. They just play this 3-man comp. And Tierria was arguably, I would say, the most busted version of all the characters. Like all the characters from the Holy Trinity, she was probably the most busted, because her passive basically made it so that your entire team got combat readiness on any action. And it was like a lot. I don't remember the specifics. If I could find it, I'll put it up on the screen. But I believe it was if she ever used like S1 or S3, you got 25% combat readiness for the whole team. Which, think about how insane that is if that's your fastest unit. And then she had multiple defense breaks. So she basically made it so that your team always had skin in the game and had damage if you would just give her a bunch of speed and effectiveness. Like her damage didn't matter as long as she could keep up Death Break and literally cycle your whole team. Enemies don't get turns, so you just win the game. Corvus here at A+, scrolling down, looking at other stuff. Dark Corvus. Dark Corvus was another controversial character, because some people said that he was the best arena offense character in the game, but nobody really like put any stock in that, because very few people actually had ML5s. If like you had an ML5, it was a big deal, guys. Like you have to understand, it was a big deal. People would rate basically how strong your account is on how many ML5s you had on your account. Like, and I remember for me, it went months before I ended up getting my very first one. So again, a lot of misinformation, I feel like, in general around ML5s at the start of the game, aside from like obviously MLKen, because there wasn't too many good answers to him. But the other ML5s, like, just so few people had them that nobody really had a good idea of how strong the characters actually were. You just wouldn't see that many ML5s for the most part out in the wild. Ken was pretty terrible also. That's another notable one to talk about here at the bottom. Ken was a lot of people's like favorite character. He was like the husbander that a lot of people wanted to play and thought was really good, but he was just terrible. And he was in desperate need of a rework even back then. He just was considered a joke of a character. And even after like his rework, I believe he was still kind of a joke until they finally buffed him yet again. So yeah, Ken was kind of for the punching bag of the game. Like we always joke about Taehu. Like Taeyu is really bad. Like Ken was literally unplayable. Probably like the worst 5-star pretty much in the entire game for a very, very long time. Moving into the mage class, we have some pretty interesting ones here. You have Tenebria, who is obviously pretty good because decent damage, sleep. Anybody that can start the turn, if you give them whatever speaker you have, if they can go first and debuff, like with Shadow Rose, like push back debuff, pretty good overall. So that's why she is here. Ball and Saison was just considered a worse version of Tenebria. Aramintha was considered, again, another one of those openers. You notice that the mages in general were mostly openers, and that's because back then, mages just, they didn't do damage. Mages kind of sucked back in the day, if I'm being honest with you. They were largely debuffers. Nobody was really playing mages for damage. Shortly after release, I forget about how long into the game, there was a balance patch that increased the attack stat of basically every single mage in the entire game, because they recognize that mages just don't do anything other than debuff. They're not particularly very good, and that's reflected here with like Basar being number 4. Basar would eventually become the boogeyman of Epic 7. Most of your favorite content creators have been playing for a while, but not since day one, probably remember Basar as this absolutely absurd opener, one of the best characters in the entire game. That was not true at launch. It wasn't until he eventually received a buff where they shuffled some things around in his kit and gave him Soulburn Ignore Effect Resistance, where he became absolutely ludicrous. He was still considered good, just not anywhere near as good as he eventually would end up being after those set of changes. And then you can see here, scrolling down with some other stuff, you have Carmine Rose. Roman was considered very whatever. Ogslots was kind of a very strange one because, again, this is largely, I feel like Ogslots being here in A, like further on down the tier list, is largely a byproduct of people just not having a ton of Moonlight 4 stars and 5 stars early on at the start of the game's lifespan. Because obviously Ogslots would later on come to define the cleave meta. He was the cleave character, right? And he didn't really change. It's just people started to get better at the game and realize, like, hey, this massive CR push, kind of OP, right? Zerato here near the bottom. Zerato has historically been, in my opinion, probably the worst 4-star in all of Epic 7. Tenebria of Illusions, Spectre Tenebria. Oh boy, this one might be kind of strange to some of you who are used to current Spectre Tenebria, who's been a top tier or a high tier DPS pretty much for the entire existence of World Arena, right? So Spectre Tenebria, back in the day, was a glorified version of the 3-star Cuirass. She basically just had poison on her S1. She was not in permanent stealth. S1 did not hit multiple targets, and the S3 did bonus damage based on the number of poison stacks, which is why you may have noticed Endless Nightmare does bonus damage based on the number of debuffs. It used to just be poison. She was considered like really bad, and she was the first Moonlight 5-star that I actually got to see in person, like played, because my guild leader ended up pulling her pretty early on. And he was kind of excited because any ML5 was a big deal, right? Back in the day, it was very hard to get them. And so he was excited that he got a character he thought looked kind of cool and no one really was playing. And I remember he just kind of was, it was like Copia. Like, he was playing Spectre for so long, and it was like, oh yeah, here's my cool poison girl, but she wasn't very good. And then when she finally ended up getting her rework, alongside of like Arbiter Vildred, early on in I should say late in the spring of 2019, like early summer, that window, yeah, that's when she started to become the force that she is now. But yeah, back in the day, Spectre, not really that good of a unit. So rounding out the rest of the mages, we have Guider, Aether, Dominion, Ludwig. Ludwig was just like Ken. He was basically the laughing stock of 5 stars, considered one of the worst of the entire game. Moving on to Thieves. Sez, I can't really like not elaborate on Sez. Sez was considered like the guy, right? He was considered the second best character overall behind ML Ken. Like, if you would re-roll for Sez, like Sez was considered the highly desirable character to reroll for. Like, it was the cool thing to do. If you knew about rerolling in a gacha game, you rerolled for Sez because he was considered, as you can see here under his world rating, his adventure rating, OP. He was also considered like decent in arena, but I think this rating is a little bit misleading because people thought he wasn't particularly that good in arena. It's actually funny because looking back on it now, Sez was only really good in arena and only pretty mediocre, I feel like, in everything else. I said it back then, and I still say it in a lot of my videos. DPS come and go, because what DPS are there for is damage, and there will always be another more efficient damage strategy. Generally, tanks and supports in gacha games are a little bit harder to phase out, which is why I started with Destina, because I felt having a strong healer, a strong support was way more important than just getting a guy who only deals damage. That's not to say that like Sez wasn't good at the start. It's just that once we actually got the rerun of Luna, because if you don't know, Luna was exclusive to the Korean server, and Koreans kind of wanted to keep it that way. We'll talk more about that with like Luna Wen in another video. But yeah, Sez was like the best DPS that we could get here on the global server at the start. And so everyone was like, gotta get Sez. If you had Sez and ML Can and the Holy Trinity, the 3 stars, you were just considered like, oh my god, he's a god, he's a whale, like there's no way. So yeah, that was it. Assassin Kali, just really good single target damage, very high damage for the time, reasonably fast for the time, because remember, right side gear kind of hard to get at this time. You can't really get necklaces or rings or boots. Like most people, their only pair of speed boots is like Pegasus boots, which you got from Labyrinth. Nobody really has speed boots, so having characters with high starting base speed is generally considered desirable. BBK, considered very good, even without the immortality buff back then, just because of lifesteal, good damage. Overall, pretty good overall in a lot of gameplay content. Arbiter Vildred, this one here being at 4 is kind of strange to me because Arbiter Vildred was considered very bad at the start. So I don't know why they have him here at 4. Because when he would his damage first off was laughable. It was very, very low compared to what it is now. And right now, obviously, it's not the best. If you played Arbiter Vildred in late 2023, early 2024, he feels like he hits like a noodle. That is literally how Arbiter Vildred felt at the start of the game. And when he would die, he would revive with the same CR. He wouldn't get the 100% CR push. So, like, you would just kill him at, like, 30% CR and be like, oh, okay, yeah, he's just stranded. He can't do anything. And then you just tap him again and he dies because he's got no bulk. So, yeah, Arbiter Vildred, not particularly very good. Corrin, a staple of most of my early teams. My early teams were Destina or Diane, alongside Falconer Clary as my tank, with Corrin as my defense breaker, with Lorena as my damage. Corrin was just considered like the budget defense breaker for the most part for pretty much every form of content. Like if it was recommended you played a defense breaker, and Tierria was like the best one. But after her nerf, Corrin was considered to be like one of the better ones, and obviously that became a holdover that later translated into being a hunt-based character. Next up, we have Cedar, Sid. It's actually really funny. This is actually kind of funny because Sid was considered like a really good Abyss character back in the day. Sid has aged pretty fantastically. He was always been a pretty good character in a lot of PvE content, and then obviously after his exclusive equipment, he became even insane in World Arena. I think this is one of those characters that has aged amazingly. Speaking of characters that have aged amazingly, Vildred's also pretty good. I feel like him being this low on the list is kind of honestly pretty criminal, because even back then, we all felt that Vildred was pretty good. My good buddy Welchie started with Vildred, and he had no regrets. I remember he caught up to me pretty quickly because of just how powerful Vildred was at farming and at clearing a lot of PvE content. So I think that these ratings don't really do Vildred justice. He's another character I think that has aged phenomenally. Not too many. I think he got like a slight buff on his very first global banner, which I will kind of just real quick, let's check it on Cecilia banner. I believe, yeah, it's right here. You can see on November 21st, this is basically when my buddy Welchie like started playing around this time. This is like they gave him like a small tweak, like a very, very tiny buff. And that was enough for him to kind of get over the edge and be the force that he was for the course of the game. The rest of the stuff here, Alexa being second from the bottom, don't really agree with that. Obviously, time has been more favorable to Alexa. She's a pretty good 3-star overall. Moving on to Soul Weavers here. So we have Elson. So Elson is kind of one of those like really overpowered characters at the start, because he had greater defense buff. This is why he was one of the Holy Trinity. He had an AoE heal and greater defense buff for the team, which was like 80 plus 80% defense, I believe, which ludicrous levels of damage mitigation. You didn't need a tank because Elson basically made everyone on your team a tank. They just didn't take damage. So the strategy was Elson makes it so you don't take damage as long as he has cooldowns. Ricorous makes it so that your cooldowns are reset. He's from the warrior class, and then obviously you have Tierria giving you the combat raise to the defense break, and then you just choose a damage dealer like Sez or Lorena or Axe God to actually lay into the defense broken unit, and you can't die. So Elson was nerfed pretty early on in the game's lifespan because greater defense buff apparently kind of overpowered. Destina was considered the other big reroll target aside from Sez. Time was not really kind to Destina. She was considered very good at the start, and like Sez, she ended up falling out of favor. It took longer than Sez, I feel like, to actually fall out of favor, but it was like around a year into the game as opposed to like 4 to 6 months with Sez where he started to fall out of favor. But Destina eventually did fall out of favor and became not very good for a very long time. She was basically replaced entirely by like Ruel of Light, by people who had her, as well as Diane. Diane was basically like the dominant Soul Weaver for a while. And then obviously we got Tamarin at some point, and after her hotfix, while her initial banner was up, those two basically ran the game. So Destina kind of very quickly started to decline. Not as fast as Sez, but did start to decline overall. Obviously back then, she didn't have a revive. She had a huge combat readiness push on her S3 whenever she cleansed a ton of debuffs. We have Lots here at number 3, which is really funny because Lots was considered very good for his CR pushing ability, but Auxiliary Lots was not considered very good for the pushing ability. So that's pretty funny. Acades, this character has always been relatively good, stable, popular throughout the course of the game's lifespan. Early World Arena, obviously this character was very good even back then. Shooting Star Acades was considered good because this was the only like really budget-friendly reviver. We didn't have Maid Chloe back then. Destina didn't revive, so Shooting Star Acades was like your only real reviver that you had a realistic chance to get unless you pulled Ruel of Light. We have Rin here, who was considered just okay. Matmo was considered just okay. Angelica here being fourth from the bottom is actually really, really funny because very quickly at the start of the global server launch, people realized Angelica is like really strong for a 4-star, and most of the best clearing teams that clearing content after Holy Trinity got nerfed was Angelica. Like Angelica was considered like the best Soul Weaver in Epic 7 alongside of Diane, I feel like, for a bit. Like Destina was still in the conversation, right? Destina was still up there, right? But the top three were Diane, Tamarin, Angelica for like the first year of the game. So to see her here at number 4 when she had no other real changes is kind of funny. Ruel of Light being third from the bottom is also hilarious because Ruel of Light would end up becoming the most dominant Soul Weaver pretty much for, you know, Abyss as well as all forms of Labyrinth when that eventually got released, as well as also PvP. Like, it is crazy to me to see Ruel at third from the bottom on the list. Then you have Aether and Hazel here. Back then we didn't have Mascot Hazel, so it's predictable why she is at the bottom. And then finally, let's wrap it up with the Ranger class here. So we have Silk. Silk was considered like the super omega broken 4-star in the game because she gave speed buff. That was like a huge deal. She gave speed buff and she slowed other people. Oh my god, you take so many turns. How do you beat Silk? It's kind of insane, right? So that's one of the ones where I'm just like, yeah, that did not age quite well. I personally didn't really think Silk was that good. And I remember a lot of people, Mullagoras, right? They were way harder to get back then than they were now. And a lot of people invested their Mullagoras into Silk because they felt that she was a pretty good investment for the long term. And I would say like maybe 6 months into the game's lifespan, she just became non-existent, non-used everywhere. You can see here, Arena S+. Not as good as Shadow Rose because Shadow Rose had the pushback, right? Or like Tenebria because she had the sleep. But slowing your opponent meant your arena defense had a very good chance of winning against the opponent because you would just get twice as many turns as them, and that's pretty strong. Leo here at S-. This is another one that has aged pretty well. Even though he was pretty high on this list to begin with, nobody really cared about Leo or paid attention to him. He was kind of like a meme. People were like, oh, it's this little kid. Nobody really cares. You didn't really see him that often. But yeah, he was pretty good, even in Arena back then. And then obviously now, as more time has gone on, we kind of know that Leo is one of the better green PvE characters in the entire game. So I think that's a pretty good placement for it. Issaria being at third is kind of criminal. I think she's easily the best one on this entire list. Obviously, I don't think I have to explain this is considered one of the best reroll targets. Even now in 2024, Issaria has had no changes. 0 since launch. Yeah, I don't think I have to explain much more of that. Yuna at 4. This is actually really funny that she's here for this reroll tier list because she can't reroll for her. I don't really think Yuna's ever been particularly good. I know when Genizod started to rise to prominence as a content creator, it was because of he played things like Yuna, right? But even back then when Jenna was playing Yuna, I don't particularly think she was that good. That's just my opinion, though. Shuri, it was really, really good. This was actually one of my first 4-stars that I played. It was Shuri and Corinne were the two that I started with. Obviously, another character hasn't really received any changes, has had many Abyss comps built around him. This is one that, again, people just evaluated, I feel like, wrong at the start. Curious being third for the bomb was hilarious because this was one of the best damage dealers for Abyss for a very long time. For like the first like year or two of the game's lifespan, you needed a Curious. It says right here, boss OP, because everybody knew this was like the best or one of the best Abyss characters, but her being third from the bomb, pretty funny. Beholder Shuri, that's a really funny name. Yeah, Watcher Shuri, it wasn't until like later on when people really got better at Cleave, like with like Ogzlotch, Judge Kisei, Celeste as another opener, and then like Watcher Shuri as like cleanup. that he kind of got his due diligence. He started to become a well-respected, cleave character, what we know him for now. So him being second from the bottom, kind of funny. Wanderer Silk. Wanderer Silk was trash at the start. Didn't have the speed imprint. Overall, yeah, just wasn't that good of a character. She was like a meme. I remember Welchie pulling this character and trying to make her work because he thought she looked hot. So for a while we were all just like, oh, it's Welchie's girl. And I remember he was the only person I knew that was actually trying to play Wanderer Silk, and she was bad. She was considered one of the worst 4 stars pretty much in the entire game. So there you go. That is a look back on the initial tier list, the reroll tier list that the community kind of like worshipped right at the start of the game's global launch back in November of 2018. So hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know down in the comments below what you think. Do you want to see me do more of these revisits of older time periods in Epic 7? I always enjoy going back and kind of reliving through some of these things. Again, seeing this image the other day when I kind of managed to pull it and find it filled me with kind of a sense of nostalgia, so I felt I'd share. As always, enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week. I'll catch you in the next one. Later now.